In today's video, I'm going to take a slightly different approach. I'm going to go back and look at the medieval philosophy concerning the heavens and the earth before they were infected with the globe model of the Renaissance and Enlightenment era. And I think we can find some very interesting things concerning the flat earth and the firmament over the flat earth. And for this video, I'm going to use the teachings and understandings of the premier philosopher of the medieval age, which was St. Thomas Aquinas. St. Thomas Aquinas was a medieval philosopher of the 13th century. He was born in 1225 AD and died on March 7th, 1274. St. Thomas Aquinas was a friar in the Dominican order. He wasn't noticed much when he was a young friar because he was very quiet, and nobody really paid attention to him until they started to read his writings, and they began to see that he was a brilliant philosopher and a very deep-thinking theologian. And because of these, the excellence of his writing and his understanding of theology and natural sciences, he became to be known as the angelic doctor. No, the angelic doctor. 300 years before Sir Francis Bacon, St. Thomas Aquinas developed a scientific method known as the order of philosophical inquiry. The first step in the philosophical inquiry order would be logic, which is like making your theory. You see some phenomenon and you want to develop a reason why it happens. Second is mathematics. You would determine some way of measuring your theory and testing it. Then next would be natural philosophy. It would be tested within nature and viewed to see if it's consistent with the way nature or sciences would show. And then the fourth thing, which is not in the St. Francis Bacon method, is moral philosophy. The idea here is if you could build a bomb that would destroy half the world, should you? And then the fifth, again, not in Francis Bacon's scientific method, is metaphysics, which is what does your knowledge tell you about who God is? The crowning achievement of St. Thomas Aquinas is the Summa Theologica. This was a summary of all the studies of St. Thomas Aquinas, a summary that fills several volumes. It answers questions on practically everything. It answers questions about God. For instance, if God is so good and God is so powerful, why is there evil? This is a question that gets answered often, and this is answered very handily in Article 49 in the treatise on the distinction of good and evil. It also answers questions about the angels, the nature of man, and the nature of the heavens and the earth. And this is the area that we are going to focus on in the Summa Theologica. The heavens are referred to in the plural, and there is great agreement among many of the ancient philosophers that there were 7 heavens. And St. Thomas Aquinas also agreed with them that there were 7 heavens. And in his Summa Theologica, Article 68, he discusses the nature of these 7 heavens in his Article 68 entitled The Work of the 6 Days of Genesis. So let's have a look at what the Bible says about the first day. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was void and empty, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved over the waters. And God said, "Be light made," and light was made. And God saw the light, that it was good. And he divided the light from the darkness. And he called the light day, and the darkness night. And there was evening and morning one day. So, on the first day, the Lord created the heaven and the earth, and light and darkness. Now, this heaven is the heaven. In Hebrew, ha-shamayim, meaning the heaven, which is the heaven where God dwells, and it's also known as the Empyrean heaven. The earth, or the material order, is still not ordered or formed. And the second day reads as follows. And God said, let there be a firmament made amidst the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made a firmament, and divided the waters that were under the firmament from those that were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day. So on the second day, God created the firmament, the crystalline heaven, and the starry heaven, possibly. And the crystalline heaven was also called the watery heavens, or the waters above. In Hebrew, this was Shamayim, as opposed to Ha Shamayim in the beginning of in verse 1 of Genesis. Ha Shamayim is the heaven. This is just heaven. So this is a different heaven below Ha Shamayim, or the heaven. And this is also referred to as the sea of glass, as mentioned in Revelations. There are two references in the book of Revelations to the sea of glass, also known as the book of the Apocalypse. If we read in chapter 4, verse 6, and in the side of the throne was, as it were, a sea of glass, like to crystal. And in the midst of the throne and around the throne were four living creatures full of eyes, before and behind. And we read further in chapter 15, verse 2. And I saw, as it were, a sea of glass mingled with fire, and them that had overcome the beast and his image and the number of his name, standing on the sea of glass, having the harps of God. It appears that this sea of glass, or crystalline heaven, serves as the floor of the throne room of God, where the heavenly creatures, saints and angels, stand to worship and adore God. And this leaves the sea of glass as very heavily tied to the Empyrean heaven, which is the actual throne of God. Now, St. Thomas Aquinas describes the firmament as a vault, much like you would see the vault of a cathedral, the ceiling of a cathedral where it would arch over. And he also mentions that the ancients thought that the sea of glass, or the waters above, or the crystalline heaven, were actually ice. So I don't know if it was really cold ice or some way that water was made firm, but they also, he tended to agree with them that it might be something like the water made of ice. So that's another thing that, it's another possibility of what could be up there. The stars were not created until the fourth day, but I thought I would address them here only because they're so closely tied to the firmament. The fixed stars are found in what is known as the starry heaven, and in the Latin it's called the sidereum. It's basically just the fixed stars. It is governed by Polaris, because it's the chief star that does not move, and the rest of the stars move around it. And I tend to agree that either the stars are angels, or that they are lights that are born by the angels. But in either case, the angels are heavily involved with moving them. Some believe these angels to be the watchers. St. Thomas Aquinas believes that these are the virtues, a certain choir of angels known as the virtues, who bear the stars around heaven. The altitude is about 10 to 12,000 or more miles. I would think that at the minimum it should be 10 to 12,000 miles up. So on the third day, God created the dry land, the water, and the seas, and the plants. So the next reference to heaven is on the fourth day. From Genesis chapter 1, verse 14. And God said, "Let there be lights made in the firmament of heaven, to divide the day and the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons, and for days and years, to shine in the firmament of heaven, and to give light upon the earth." And it was so done. And God made two great lights, a greater light to rule the day, and a lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And he set them in the firmament of the heaven to shine upon the earth, to rule the day and the night, and to divide the light and the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And the evening and the morning were the fourth day. So on the fourth day God formed and ordered the heaven of the luminaries, which contains the sun, the moon, and the wandering stars. And this heaven is definitely below the firmament, as it says in the scriptures that God placed the sun, the moon, and the wandering stars in the firmament. And the wandering stars might not be limited to the heaven of the luminaries. It's possible there is a question as to whether they can go up to where the starry heaven is. I don't think there's a barrier between the heaven of the luminaries and the starry heaven. But at the bottom of the heaven of the luminaries, there appears to be a second hard barrier. This barrier is evidenced by the finding of Libyan glass in areas where the track of the sun is particularly strong, like the Sahara Desert. And it appears that the altitude of this barrier is around 2,500 to 3,000 miles. A few days ago, I was sent an email from another person researching the flat Earth who had made some lunar observations in conjunction with a friend of his. He was in Portland and the friend of his was in Boston, and they made some observations about the height of the moon with respect to each location. And here's what they sent me. The diagram shows their locations in Portland and Boston, and the distance between them as 2,630 miles. And the heading angles or sight angles that they made in recording their observations. And in Portland, the angle of elevation for the moon observation was 60.2 degrees, and the elevation angle in Boston for the sighting of the moon was 50.9 degrees. I have laid out the angles and distances of the sightings as shown. Boston is about 0.54 degrees further north than Portland, but considering the angles and dimensions involved, it turns out to be an insignificant number. So I'm just going to assume they're pretty much on the same latitude. Now, I've corrected the angle sightings to get the interior angles for trigonometric purposes, and I think we've got everything laid out the way we need to get it laid out. The first thing we'll need to do is to get the distance to the orthogonal to the sighting point. The distance to the orthogonal can be obtained by taking a ratio of the cosine of the two angles and then multiplying it by the distance from Portland to Boston divided by 2. I've done this with the Portland side of the equation, and I get 175 miles. In order to obtain the Boston distance to the orthogonal, all I have to do is subtract it from the total distance, and that gives me 1,455 miles. Then we also have to determine the distance of the sighting line, which we can get by taking the distance to the orthogonal divided by the cosine of the angle. In this case, on C, the distance C from Portland to the sighting line would be 175 divided by the cosine of 50, which equals 1,828 miles. And on the Boston side, It's 1,455 miles divided by the cosine of 44, and that yields 2,023 miles. And finally, we have to determine the height of the moon based on the sighting distance and the angle of the elevation. And so from Portland, we can determine this by multiplying 1,828 times the tangent of 60.2 degrees, and this gives us a height of 3,192 miles. And if we do the same thing on the Boston side by multiplying 2,023 times the tangent of 50.9 degrees, we get a distance and height of 2,489 miles. Now there is a slight variation, and this could be due to atmosphere. There could be a number of factors, but we'll just take an average, and that will give us a height of 2,840 miles. I have some more thoughts about the heaven of the luminaries. It appears that the moon is about 500 to 1,000 miles below the sun in its track, and the sun is usually calculated at about 3,500 to 5,500 miles above the Earth. It is possible that they need to be separated because they have different electromagnetic properties, and if they came too close to each other, they could interfere electromagnetically. That would be an electromagnetic reason why you would see this, a difference in height. And also, it appears that the sun may have its own separate casing around it, because we read in the scriptures in Psalm 18 or Psalm 19 verse 6, he has set his tabernacle in the sun, and he as a bridegroom coming out of the bride chamber. So that seems to imply that there's some kind of casing around the sun. And so either this casing around the sun or a hard barrier below the heaven of the luminaries is possibly what is causing the phenomenon of Libyan glass in the Sahara Desert and other locations. I spoke to somebody recently who said they found something like Libyan glass in the deserts in Utah. So, it may not be limited to just simply the Sahara Desert. The bottom three heavens were formed and ordered on the fifth day. The first of these is what is called by some the ethereal heaven. Not a lot is known about this heaven from the writings of the ancients or from St. Thomas Aquinas, other than there is a layer of ether that exists above the atmospheric layers of heaven. So this one is where we see a lot of electromagnetic phenomenon, or the aurora borealis, red sprites that occur above severe thunderstorms. There seems to be a barrier. I don't think it's a hard barrier, but there is some kind of barrier because the aurora borealis and the other electromagnetic phenomena do not go below 53 miles. So the barrier may be electromagnetic in nature, so it may be some kind of a soft barrier. The next level of heaven is called the cloudy heavens. And this is where we find the atmosphere beginning, and this is the area that contains clouds and winds. And the highest altitude clouds that we know of are the noctilucent clouds that run between around 53 miles. So as you can see, there is also a certain separation here, or hard barrier. And finally, the lowest level of heaven is what they call the airy heaven, or St. Thomas Aquinas referred to it as the heaven of the birds. And this contains actual birds and flying creatures. So the altitude of the highest flying bird is Rappel's vulture, which goes up to 37,000 feet, that puts the top level of the airy heaven at 7 miles, which is just a little bit over the height of Mount Everest. So there you have it, folks, the 7 heavens. And I hope that we have all learned something from St. Thomas Aquinas and the medieval and ancient philosophers.